But he has got a great interest in this arena and is hoping to develop other ways to share this information with our community and beyond. So we're privileged to get this preview at this point in his research process. He's got lots of roots in Chicago, both at Garrett Evangelical Seminary, which is our United Methodist Seminary up there, and the University of Chicago, where he got his PhD. So I won't take any more time, but we are delighted, Gary, to have you. Let's give him a nice welcome.
Thank you. Now, if anybody's wondering how any of this applies to the United Methodist Church, let me just give you a reminder. Increasingly, over the last few decades, the United Methodist Church has become more of a Southern church in terms of its membership. I'll give you some statistics, and this is really important in kind of comparison to, and we deal a lot with the formation of the Christian right tonight. What I'm going to tell you again is not simply evangelicalism. And of course, the United Methodist Church is not one thing. We never have been. But it's a combination of progressive, moderate, evangelical, leaning towards fundamentalists, all the way to just about humanistic atheists. That's the range, but as far as where people are located, in terms of attending membership, percentage of attending membership in the United Methodist Church, 38% of United States Methodism is within the Southeast jurisdiction, which includes the Carolinas, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Virginia, Georgia. Wow, yeah, Georgia's a huge one. There are two very large conferences in Georgia. And then 21% of the South Central jurisdiction, which includes Texas, Oklahoma, up through Great Plains, right? So Kansas, Nebraska, Arkansas, New Mexico, thanks. 20% in the North Central jurisdiction. So now we're north of the old Mason-Dixon line. Mostly, not totally in terms of culture. For the North Central jurisdiction, that's the Illinois conferences, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Ohio, and Indiana. And Indiana, if anybody's ever been to Indiana, it's a lot like the state of Illinois, which is there's Gary and that part around Chicago in Indiana, and then it's south. And in terms of culture, it's more southern. In Illinois, while Chicago and kind of urban culture goes about as far south as I-80, for those of you who know, you ever traveled that direction. South of I-80, you are closer culturally to the deep south than you are to Chicago. And downstate legislators, I'm from Illinois, I know. Downstate legislators still wish that Chicago would just fall into Lake Michigan. Culturally, that makes 59% of United Methodism in the parts of the country that, to be frank, were slaveholding states, which is somewhat important to what we're talking about tonight. The Western jurisdiction, which tends to be the most liberal jurisdiction in the church, somewhat North Central also. I mean, my own conference, Northern Illinois is. Western jurisdiction is a total of 6% of the church. So as we come together in, a couple of weeks now, for General Conference to decide what the future of this church looks like, whatever polarizations are around in the country, you can expect are also in our church. And I've seen no evidence that we as a church are any better at dealing with our differences than the culture as a whole is. Fact is, as we're going to talk about tonight, I think there were parts of our Christian culture have helped drive the divisions that we're currently seeing. It's also the case, by the way, that if you look at the General Counsel Finance Administration's website, where they have all kinds of great statistics, and you look at where the top 100 churches in terms of membership are located, there's hardly a single one, there's just a handful or so in that top 100, which is outside of the southeast and the south central jurisdictions. And David, you probably go to a Tall Steeple Church group, and I'm sure that echoes who comes.
Totally.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Let's talk a little bit about last week for those of you, kind of a reminder, try to do 60, 70 years of somewhat interpreted moments in history. It's a fire hose. Sorry about that. Last week, part of what I started with is that religion and politics run in the same social neural pathways in society, which means that you can never fully pull them apart. We've tried to pull them apart in the modern world. We've tried to pull them apart to make the United States, but we have to acknowledge this is a somewhat artificial division of things. They run in the same pathways. The same way that I said, it's sort of like brackish water, right? where that fresh water and that salt water comes together, and it takes a particular kind of creature to want to live in those brackish waters. So there's particular kinds of fish and reptiles and gators and the like that can tolerate, because to be there, you have to tolerate a wide range of salinity, of salt content. Well, I think that's sort of where we're at these days. Can we tolerate a wide range of the stuff that's in the water in order to be able to see what kind of life we can have together in this? They run the same neural pathways. And I talked about that, for instance, last week in saying both religion and politics deal with the realms of meaning-making, of belonging, of moral sense or moral compass, and of empowerment liberation, as in, what's the meaning of life? What's the meaning of my life? On a religious side, how do we talk about what is ultimate, which for us in the Christian tradition we would name as God, or God is revealed in the person and ministry of Jesus Christ, Jesus of Nazareth, or meaning in politics. What's the meaning of the nation? What's the meaning of our common life? How do we symbolize that? How do we express that? What kind of tolerance for diversity in that meaning can we allow? Belonging. What's it take to be a member here? What's it take to be a member of the body of Christ? These are belonging sorts of questions. Who belongs? Also always includes that, well, therefore who doesn't belong? It's really impossible to have anything less than kind of Swiss cheese boundaries. If you have no boundaries whatsoever, you don't have a group. And in fact, sociologists would say people, actually psychologists would say the same thing. The scariest kind of person is a person without any boundaries. You could also say the same thing about nations. Nations that have we can expand infinitely, can be quite a dangerous nation. So defining who's in and who's out is actually quite important work, and not possible to not do that work in some way. Moral sense. What do we know? How do we know what's right and wrong? A big part of moral sense, whether in the political realm or in the religious realm, is and our meaning. How we come about meaning really helps with this. How do we define the gap between what is and what ought to be? Where are we at now as a nation? Do you like that? If you have any complaints about that, that suggests to you what your commitments are and where you think it ought to be. Well, how do you close it? What do we do to close that gap? That's your moral, establish a moral compass and a set of moral activities, whether that again be in religion or in politics, and empowerment liberation. I mean, every religion starts out with some kind of problematic, as in, what is it that we as humankind, as individual human beings ought to be, what our community ought to be, and what prevents us from getting there? how do you get empowered by your faith? Or how do you get empowered by your politics? To become more what you believe you really ought to be. To transcend where we're at right now. Both religion and politics run in those realms. That's again why I talk about religion and politics. They run in the same neural pathways. I personally would not want to see, ever want to see, the United States become like France. In that France in their revolution, in the latter part of the 18th century, they said they wanted to scrub religion completely out of public life. And to this day, in France, they have restrictions over about wearing religious symbolism in public. So their Muslim, their more recent Muslim immigrants to France are pushing their boundaries, wearing the hijab, but also the hijab with the full face mask, and any sort of symbolism, even wearing a cross in public in parts of, this is France. This is not us. I didn't use this image last week. I'll use it this week. Daniel Borstein, who was a librarian of Congress and I understand was from Broken Arrow, used to say that what the Constitution did is create the equivalent of an empty holy of holies. You know how in the Jewish temple in Jerusalem that the Romans destroyed? Well, when the Romans came and destroyed it, and the general who was in charge went in as they were taking the temple, he wanted to go into the Holy of Holies, you know, that part where the high priest goes only twice a year on the Day of Atonement, and he wanted to see what the Jewish God looked like. And he came out incredibly disappointed because, of course, make no graven images, there's no image of God in the Holy of Holies. Borstein said what the Constitution of the United States does, it creates an empty Holy of Holies. It creates a space in which different persons of different religions can try to bring their religion into that public space. You're not barred from doing so, but no religion gets to set up in that public space and say, we're the thing. I love that image. Empty Holy of Holies is what we've done. We have been a very religiously oriented people. I wouldn't want to keep all my Christian ethics out of public life as I try to move into it and try to influence anything legislatively or culturally. So, also, last week, talked about the apparent centrifugal forces at the end of World War II that yielded to centrifugal forces in the 1960s, and more tensions and cracks appeared. And I need to say it this way. That the 50s that we were, came out of World War II, we're feeling together. And the energy seemed to be we're together as a culture. That's a highly white point of view. Because you also have to remember, 1955 is when the bus boycotts started. And 1954 is Brown v. Board of Education, and the beginning of the desegregation of public schools. And as the liberation and kind of throwing off oppression movements in the 1960s gained steam, they didn't come from nowhere. They had long roots in this culture. That's why I say there was tension and more cracks began to appear by the end of the 1950s. As we look at liberty or freedom and justice for all, as they relate to race and gender and sexuality, these were all the cracks that were definitely appearing that became more than cracks in the 1960s. And these were cracks, of course, not just in society. These were cracks in church that began to be wider and wider. We also had competing narratives beginning to emerge, especially in the 60s and well into the 70s, of what the United States both has been and should be really challenging that meaning part of us. This is, of course, when we started hearing, America, love it or leave it. And I heard that in my house once or twice. I wasn't the one saying it. You know, get a haircut, get a job, hippie, and all that kind of stuff. The civil rights struggles, starting with African American civil rights, but also looking at women's rights and Chicano rights and gay and lesbian rights and Native American rights and the like. The civil rights struggles at home, and then the Vietnam War really challenged the American myth of innocence. And by myth, I don't mean falsehood. I'm using it the way that religion scholars use the term, which is a deep, kind of at a story and symbolic level understanding of who and what we are. So there was a whole lot of expression in the 1960s of, because America does it, it's good, rather than it's good, and did America do it or not? Again, in church and society, the sense of goodness was being challenged. The other thing is that it was in the 70s, I would say, for sure, that the replacement of the ecumenical main line, which includes, again, what became in 1968 the United Methodist Church, and the Presbyterians and Congregationalists, and the United Church of Christ, and mainstream Lutherans, ELCA, what became the ELCA and the like, Disciples of Christ, Episcopalians. These were the main line. The ecumenical main line was replaced with the evangelical main line as the dominant base of U.S. Protestantism. So that it wasn't the Reinhold Niebers and the Paul Tillocks and the seminary professors of places like Phillips that publicly people would go to and ask, you know, what's going on with religion? Now it became more of the evangelical or what the emerging megachurch pastors and persons like Jerry Falwell, and of course throughout this era would have been Billy Graham. For this week, this is where we're headed. Very briefly, I'm going to give some different understandings of church and state, religion and politics in European history that affected the development of the early United States. I want to talk about fundamentalism, evangelicalism, and public life. Specifically, I'm going to get some into the issues of race, civil rights, the IRS, private schools, what became known as the Southern Strategy, and then abortion and homosexuality as issues around which the Christian right formed. I will say something too about the most well-known for you all out of the Christian right would have been the organizations, the Moral Majority and the Christian Coalition. I want to say a little bit about them. And then towards the end talk some about perhaps the most extreme form of the Christian right, which is dominionism, sometimes known as Reconstruction, or Christian nationalism. And if you want to get just a quick overview of where this is headed when it comes to the cultural issues that called forth the Christian right, I'm going to tell you a story that includes the Justice Department and Bob Jones University, and evangelical disappointment with Jimmy Carter, and the formation of the Moral Majority, and then the organizational powers and dynamics of the Christian Coalition, and their ability to put forth many candidates for judges at the federal level to hopefully control what sincerely held religious belief means in the courts. I don't know why sometimes my slides are double clicking on some things, so the world of the biblical worldview. If you read you go to an organization's website and or a church's website, and you see either Christian worldview or a biblical worldview as what they are there to deliver, saying this is what we are about, my suspicions go up at that point in time. It may be that I'm wrong, and I try to always hold, when my suspicions go up, I also try to hold them as loosely as I can, because I find out I'm wrong. I can be wrong. I can make the wrong assumptions about things. But biblical worldview will often include some combination of these things, not all of which I disagree with. God created and governs everything. Now the created part is one sense. The governs everything seems to mean that, well, governs in what way? Is that as in actually controls everything that happens? We'll see about that. Jesus died for your sins. In theological terms, we'll say this is a substitutionary atonement, that we all deserved a punishment that Jesus took on himself, and therefore died for our sins to free us from sin. That happens to be fundamental to evangelicalism as a whole. Except that this world includes things and people influenced by Satan. In the biblical worldview, it is, and this is a very interesting dividing line, even within the evangelical world, as to how they define evangelical. Since there are a bunch of evangelicals who say, I'm an evangelical, but I do not believe that Satan's an actual being of some sort. Believe in evil, and say that there's real influence, because it has real effects, it's really evil, but don't believe in Satan. And there are some, like the Barna group, who would say, if you don't believe in Satan as a being, you're not a true evangelical. But in biblical worldview, when folks are using that, they're very often saying that Satan is alive and real and running some things on this planet, including things that we see in that gap between is and ought. We see a whole lot of Satan's work in there for what's wrong. And persons who do the work, do that kind of work, therefore are being used by Satan. Now think about what we're doing here, which we're talking about how religious points of view affect how we also approach public life. There's a great spiritual battle being waged in your soul, in all of our souls, and in society between God and Satan. Basically, in this kind of worldview, you're going to be beholden to one of these two, Satan or God. Those are the two masters. You'll serve one or the other in this point of view. And in this point of view, God blesses righteous nations and punishes unrighteous ones. Yeah.
Do you think it'd be fair to say, point number one, God created and governs everything, that it might be reasonable to say that point number one be that God exists, and then God created and governs everything? Is there anything after that? Is there a God?
You could say that, I would say, number one assumes what you just said about that there is God. Right, absolutely. Absolutely. Let me give you I didn't move that slide in there, okay. That's fine. In a few minutes here, I'm going to give you a who's on first, because I'm going to use a bunch of terms about evangelicalism and fundamentalism, Pentecostal and charismatic. I want you to understand some of the differences between them, because not all these things equal the Christian right. Christian right is a very particular subset of what I'm talking about tonight, about something which I do consider to be dangerous, both as an American as well as a Christian. First, a little bit of governance in Christian times. So remember, Christianity starts as a movement within Judaism, that sometime by the end of the 1st century, beginning of the 2nd century CE, church and synagogue begin to pull apart. Christianity begins to form into a separate and distinct religion, and becomes one of the despised religions of the empire, for things such as refusing to offer incense to the emperor, or in their secret society meetings, they eat somebody. And Romans accused early Christians of cannibalism, and the like. But in the 4th century, Constantine is the emperor. He has a vision with some words to the effect being said to him in the vision that with this symbol conquered, it's a cross of sorts. He wins the battle. He decides Christianity is the thing, and makes it first the religion of the empire. And then by the end of the 4th century, it becomes the only legal religion of the empire. So within like 80 years' time, Christianity goes from being illegal, kill 'em kind of religion to now they're the religion of the empire. And from that time, from Constantine's time, really up until the 16th century, to be an imperial citizen meant to be a Christian. Same thing. They go together. Citizenship and church membership. And, you know, in Romans 13, it says all authority belongs to God, and all the rulers have their authorities, all those are derived from God. Which is so interesting that was even in Paul writing that while under imperial Rome. Now, interestingly, you come up to the 14th century, and you know, some local rulers are starting to push back against this because they don't want to be ruled by the church. Because what the church basically said is, and Boniface VIII was the one who laid it out this way. He said there are two swords. There's the sword of the secular world, and there's the sword of the spiritual world. Now, interestingly, both swords belong to the church. If God is the ruler, if Christ is in charge, and if the emperor is there as in the hierarchy of this, therefore, for them, put the Pope in there. It actually goes God, Christ, Emperor. And the Pope is saying, well, I could wield both swords. We're giving permission, we're granted permission for the secular rulers to have the sword of state, and the church keeps the spiritual sword. But in terms of hierarchy, the secular sword is subservient to the spiritual sword. Now again, not all the rulers like this, but this was the church's attitude. Church ruled everything. Then along comes the Reformation. You know, Luther and Calvin and Zwingli and everything, we hear about 16th, 17th century. And a new formulation comes together. Cuius regio, eius religio. Whoever rules in a region determines the religion. So again, there's no religious freedom. That's not an idea yet. In the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, there were two choices that a ruler could say, my realm is Lutheran or my realm is Catholic. That's the deal. No other choices. In 1648, 100 years later nearly, in the Peace of Westphalia, Calvinism gets included. Right? Now, now we've come up already here to 1648, before this kind of peace is settled. And a couple of long-standing wars come to an end then. 1648, well, Jamestown was 1607. Plymouth, 1620. So there's already people whose lives have been shaped by the battles that killed and in some places decimated the populations of Europe have already emigrated to the colonies, in part to get away from this. Because who was tolerated again? It wasn't separatists like the Pilgrims. Jamestown was a different matter. And remember that toleration is different from freedom or acceptance. So the revision was, there's no religious freedom yet, but we'll tolerate a little bit more. So along come the American colonies and the formation of the Republic. First, you have a continuation of basic Reformation settlements where there were established religions in a number of colonies, such as Virginia or Massachusetts, where Virginia was the Anglican Church, and in Massachusetts it was the Congregational Church, which the Puritan, which is the outgrowth of the Puritans. There were some experiments in toleration. Rhode Island, which remember was originally was Rogues Island. You know, Roger Williams, the Baptist who was thinking straight. But Williams believed in separate. He was one of the first to, on these shores, to put forth the idea of complete separation of church and state. Reason being, because the state would always corrupt the church, to try to take the church, the church and the church's symbols and use it for the state's own ends. Now, he also thought that every single church on earth was corrupt. He was just thoroughly about everybody and everything was corrupt. Therefore, it was a matter of, that's part of the Baptist, the original Baptist belief in the sanctity of individual conscience. Do nothing that impinges upon an individual's conscience. Especially, don't allow persecution from either the church or the state, because again, you will allow if the church allows the state to use it, the state will always persecute for its own sake, using religion to do so. That was Roger Williams' original insight and idea. And then there was a place like Pennsylvania, which practiced genuine toleration. Founded again, William Penn, Quaker. Quakers were amongst the most hated religious sects in the colonies. Tarred and feathered, strung up. I mean, it was seriously, they were hated for a wide variety of reasons. So Penn founds Pennsylvania and says, y'all come. Massachusetts, by the way, didn't disestablish the Congregationalist Church until 1833. So some 50 years after the United States is founded, and a little less than 50 years after the Constitution is put in place, this establishment didn't apply to every state. It only applied to the federal government when they started out. Okay. The churches, however, were deeply ambiguous in their support for disestablishment. Really? Nobody gets to be established? The historian Sidney Meade said in the early Republic that it was just a couple of Baptists, Roger Williams one, John Leland was another, who advocated theologically for the separation of church and state. Says most everybody else just had to go along with it because they couldn't figure out a better way. Because he said, you know, most of the religions that came here, the Christian denomination came to both worship in their own way and persecute in their own way. And he said, you know, this was the separation of church and state for a lot of these religious leaders was like a cow chewing its cud, where you can't swallow it and you can't spit it out. So we form the secular constitution because it doesn't start in the name of God on it. It starts with we the people. We the people are the sovereign. Is the sovereign. We is sovereign. We do article, like I said last week, you do article 6, which is the article in the Constitution, says there shall not be any religious test for any office. And the First Amendment with the free exercise and the disestablishment clauses to it regarding religion. Sometime later, it was in fact in the 1950s or 60s, John Courtney Murray, a Jesuit, a tremendous scholar, who did a lot. In fact, he was the author of the Vatican II's Declaration of Religious Freedom, where the Catholic Church first turned from their old viewpoint, which is error has no rights. Hear that? Error has no rights. That was the Catholic point of view from 1870 until about 1963. And John Courtney Murray was the one who wrote that he actually made the Catholic Church sound a little more like Baptists in the Declaration of Religious Freedom. He said the First Amendment is not an article of faith. It is an article of peace. How do we keep peace among these warring people who just a few decades before the founding of this country were tearing each other's heads off, and I mean that literally? How do we keep peace here? Something like the First Amendment. It's an article of peace, not an article of faith. That said, there's always been, up until maybe the 60s or 70s, a sense that there's an unofficial religion here in America. And again, it was Protestantism of some form from the founding days up until he said it was about 2012 when less than 50% of the country was Protestant. In the early colonies, the religious atmosphere was dominated by the established churches, those who had some kind of establishment with them, the Presbyterians, Congregationalists, and Episcopalians. Around 1800, Thomas Jefferson, who looked into the future, said, he'd written this Bible. He had, while in office, here's Jefferson, going through the Bible, and I think it was French, Latin, and Greek in the New Testament. He's got a razor blade of some sort, or scissors, and he's cutting out all of the miracles of Jesus and all of the things that he said sound like priestcraft or papist kind of stuff. And he puts together this book called The Morals of Jesus, which he thinks this is the true Jesus. And he said, young people are just going to flock to this kind of thing. And this is Unitarianism. He says, I can foresee the entire country is going to become Unitarian. Didn't happen because part of what he didn't see is that in the early 1800s there's the so-called upstarts who were not the established ones, the Methodists, the Disciples, and the Baptists, the ones who took the West and who followed the settlers, and in some cases, were right along with the settlers, especially in the case of the Methodists. We seem to get a jump start on everybody. And in the country, beginning in the early 1800s, went through what is known as the Second Great Awakening. And there's a picture here of the Frontier Revival meeting, or camp meeting, of which there were thousands of these protracted meetings. And we, along with the Baptists in particular, and the Cumberland Presbyterians, the regular Presbyterians, thought this is against predestination to try to revive somebody into faith. The Methodists said we had no qualms about that, helping God along. And we quickly became the biggest in the country. Fact is, something you have to understand is that the Methodists, the Baptists, and Disciples in the 1900s were the evangelicals. We defined what evangelicalism meant. So, you know, who kind of fits in that mold or with that word has changed some. And you don't see Catholics too much in here, even though they were growing in number, especially in the latter part of the 19th century. They were just too insular during this phase of American life to have much public face. They saw themselves very much as a persecuted minority, one instance of which is the formation of parochial schools happened because they were pretty certain that schools were distinctively Protestant in culture, and they were correct. We were. So after the Civil War, here's where we start seeing some of the parting of the ways of two different parties forming out of what had been evangelicalism. The first is when we talk about the development of the two-party system. I mentioned this last week. About the issue of slavery, the church, and let's talk Methodist Church in particular now, we were really split, and it went north-south lines very much as to whether slavery was a moral issue or whether it was simply an economic issue. And not everybody in those days would have said, well, it's an economic issue, isn't it also a moral issue? No. Because the line went something like this. How do you understand this life? Is what we're doing here simply a rehearsal, a gymnasium, a vestibule, as you prepare to enter into the next life, into eternal life? Or does this life itself have value in and of itself? If everything is about getting your soul right with God, then that's what belongs in the pulpit, and only that. If it's getting right with God, but also getting right with each other, and perhaps living quite a few years with each other, then maybe social issues also have a role in the pulpit. I know there are still places today where you can start a fight as to whether or not you talk about any social issue in church. This goes deeply, a good 150 years or so back into our history. So it's a two-party system. Is it just vertical, or is it also horizontal that we talk about in church? Science, Origin of the Species, Darwin published that in 1859, which of course evolution, and challenging Bishop Ussher's chronology. Bishop Ussher was the one who said, if you trace back all of the generations in the Bible, the earth was created in 4004 BC. Pushing it back, no, a fossil record would say that not all of these things came off the ark. Sometime on this side of that. And then Vatican I. Vatican I is important. I'm going to throw it in there as important because that is the 1870 is the date when the Pope at the time first spoke ex cathedra, meaning from the bishop's chair. That when the Pope speaks in matters of morals and doctrine, the Pope is speaking infallibly. That was not a forever stance in the Catholic Church. That's from 1870. Part of what's going on there is this. Science, not only the origin of species, but the fossil record, astronomy, other sorts of things, various forms of biology we're developing, and beginning to challenge the all-inclusiveness of using the Bible as a book of science, as a book of faith, as well as a book of science. That this is scientifically going to line up with all the rest of the record. And this is when the influence, in the post-Civil War era, is when the influence of German universities began with so-called higher criticism, meaning starting to look at the Bible as a piece of history, looking at the biblical text and saying, well, this is poetry, this appears to be chronology, but it's chronology of a particular kind. This maybe is is a parable. You can separate it out and talking about parables, a distinctive form of literature. This may be allegory. I mean, looking at the Bible as a variety of different kinds of literature rather than specifically about, well, it's a fairly literal, more wooden reading of it. And the development of seminary education. You may know that the Methodist Church and the United Methodist Church, that we've had seminaries now since the 1840s. But there was a huge debate then, which has never quite 100% died, as to what the value of seminary is for the church. On the one hand, for somebody like Eliza Garrett, who was one of the founders of Garrett Evangelical School Seminary, where I went, said, I'm so glad that my pastors know something about saving souls, but I wish they also had some grammar. While on the other side, there were those who saying, yeah, and you're going to train these seminarians who know how to parse Greek verbs, but they don't know how to save a soul. Fundamentalist modernist controversy. So coming in now to the 1900s. No, there it is. Now we're going to start seeing how different groups begin to really split off from each other as we react differently to the modern world. In 1910 and 1915, there were a series of tracts that were fundamentals. And the fundamentals basically said we should interpret the Bible literally, that the Bible is inerrant in all matters, rather than it should be read historically, and the like. And they, the literalness of the virgin birth, that Jesus was bodily raised from the dead. These fundamentals began to be put forth as this is what a true Christian believes. We began to divide out about the value of this age versus the age to come, as in how much of the social world do we deal with and try to correct that for anything that is wrong. In fact, in the early part of the 19th turn of the 20th century, persons who began to be associated with the fundamentalist movement said, stay out of politics. Politics are a waste of time. If you believe that everything that's important is about your relationship with Jesus Christ and getting right with Jesus and the salvation of your soul, then everything about politics is adiaphora. It's stuff that doesn't matter. Versus those who said, no, actually there's a whole lot of suffering in this world that we can alleviate or ameliorate if we really put our minds to it. What we saw from the conservative side of Protestant Christianity was a couple of involvements in public life in the early part of the 20th century. First being Prohibition, which was broadly Baptist, Methodist, lots of conservative groups, not German Lutherans. German Lutherans were in fact at that point the enemy, beer and all that. And the WCTU, Women's Christian Temperance Union, and all that was, in fact, without making fun of that, there was a lot of incredible amount of drunkenness throughout the 19th century. I mean, a lot of field workers of various sorts were pretty much sloshed by 10 in the morning. Factory work was, of course, dangerous if people were drinking. Drinking was incredibly heavy in this country in the 19th century. And women were in the forefront of trying to see that changed. And so it was a serious social issue. Prohibition comes in 1920 to 1930. The second involvement of conservatives was around the Scopes trial in 1925. That was the teaching evolution with the famous Clarence Darrow versus William Jennings Bryan, multiple-time presidential candidate, also fundamentalist Christian. And remember, the science teacher lost that. It was actually, the Scopes lost that trial. And publicly, the public perception is that this backwoods, redneck, anti-intellectual Christianity needs to go away. And what happened is that the more conservative form of Protestant Christianity withdraws from public life until the 1960s. There's an old term that you can't find much anymore called evangelical liberals. And there were lots of people, including a very famous Methodist theologian, Georgia Harkness, who identified as an evangelical liberal. Because in the mid-century, things weren't completely pulled apart yet, as what they became by the end of the century. The Federal Council of Churches had formed in 1908, and the ecumenical mainline is going pretty strong. They're the ones that are well known in public life. And in cities were, of course, more and more people were moving to cities. There was a movement called the social gospel that came around, which said that Christ also wants people to live a good life now. And this is when we first actually moved from churches that were predominantly for worship and Sunday school to that full service 7-day-a-week program-oriented church that was called the institutional church movement, where we're no longer just building basically a sanctuary with some Sunday school rooms, but you were doing something where there might be a gym, where there might be a health clinic and other sorts of things associated with it. This was all that. Same time that settlement houses like Jane Addams in Chicago was being developed. However, some people will say, well, where did the evangelicals come from then in the 1970s? Well, it depends how you were paying attention. In the latter part of the 1880s, 1890s, is what's called the Holiness Movement. Anybody here come out of the Church of the Nazarene? Well, Holiness Movement Church broke off from Methodism. The district superintendent out of California helped that break happen, where there were Methodists and others who were saying, but there ought to be more going on to perfection, which involves another outpouring of the Holy Spirit. The Azusa Street revival out in California is what Pentecostal churches understand as the foundation of Pentecostalism. And I'm going to talk about that in just a moment, what Pentecostalism is. As the 20th century went on, this business about having any hyphenateds, like the evangelical liberals, became harder and harder to hold on to. And there was a lot of Southern culture that was being preserved in white Southern churches. Not just the South. You could find the KKK in Wisconsin. And in fact, the KKK as it is today had its rebirth in Indiana. So places we often think of as northern. But there was also, like, this is a rather famous picture. It shows up a number of places where you both have Jesus Saves and then obviously a Klan gathering within a church setting. It's important to say that when we talk about evangelicalism, it's actually been the numerical mainline ever since the Second Great Awakening. The so-called ecumenical mainline, as we often heard about, Methodism, we're part of the mainline. Yeah, but never numerically. Because look at even back in the World War II, generation here, Protestants 57% of the population, 30% are identified as evangelical, 22% as mainline. Even back then, whereas today, as far as younger generation, 19% evangelical, 11% mainline. But the mainline has always been, numerically, there always have been more evangelicals, more would identify as in evangelical churches such as Southern Baptist than identify in mainline churches. All right, since I don't know what happened to my slide on who's on first, let me give it to you now. Evangelicals, the broadest use of that term, it's kind of the umbrella for all the rest I'm going to say, because the fundamentals of evangelicalism include an experience of being born again. In other words, a second birth, that in relationship with Jesus Christ has in a profound way renewed me. Tends to be towards literal when it comes to biblical interpretation. So reading kind of in a traditional, more literal sort of way. And again, the belief in the foundational part of the new birth. That's evangelicalism. Lots of Americans identify as evangelicals. Fundamentalists are something quite different. Jerry Falwell once said a fundamentalist is an evangelical with something to be angry about. Fundamentalists tend to have a much harder worldview. Contrast, for instance, between fundamentalism and Pentecostalism. Martin Marty, when he did a project on fundamentalism worldwide, said it this way. It says, fundamentalists tend to look at the world this way. Pentecostals tend to look at the world this way. Fundamentalists are those who, there is an edge to fundamentalism. They would be evangelicals who, for instance, would remain very traditional, conservative, patriarchal when it comes to male-headed households. Evangelicals tend to bend a little more. You'll see some evangelical churches, including some of the mega churches today, with female pastors. Would never happen in a fundamentalist church. Has to be male. In fact, it's in terms of even teaching, women don't teach men. That would be part of fundamentalism. Evangelicals through places like Fuller Seminary or Wheaton College or the like have developed a kind of very strong intellectual apparatus. Evangelicals are not the kind of anti-intellectuals that Richard Hofstadter and others talked about in the 50s and 60s that were so much a part of what they saw as American Protestant church life at that point. They tend to be, evangelicals will tend to at least stretch some in trying to include some of the modern world. Some evangelicals, for instance, would say and have embraced the need to address climate change. Whereas in a fundamentalist world these days, pretty much no, there is no climate change. Fundamentalists tend to have things in their box in a way so that here's the box, and there are very narrow doorways as to who can get in that box. Evangelicals tend to have a world where there's a little more Swiss cheese, a few more doors and windows there. So evangelicals overall, fundamentalists, Pentecostals. The fundamental thing about Pentecostals is the movement of the Holy Spirit trumps all theology. It's the experience of the Holy Spirit. Fundamentalists really don't like Pentecostals. Because in fundamentalist world, everything is like this. In the Pentecostal world, anything's changeable based on the movements of the Spirit. The Spirit blows where it wills, where she wills. So the experience of the Holy Spirit, some direct experience of it in worship, and the experience of healing, Pentecostal goes back to the Azusa Street revival back in about 1907 or thereabouts. Pentecostals also have tended to be, amongst all Protestant groups, the most religious and the most ethnically, racially integrated of any of us. There's something appealing cross-racial ethnic groups about that movement of the Spirit. Pentecostals also are not opposed at all, and sometimes put up front, women in leadership. Women leaders were early in the Pentecostal movement. They kind of got moved out by patriarchy, and in the last 10 years or so, you see more women leaders in Pentecostal congregations. I mean, I realize that Sharon Daugherty was, she and her husband, they were co-pastors formally as they were listed, and when her husband died, and she actually was pastor of that church for a while. Could not have happened again in a fundamentalist church.
Yeah. Catherine Kuhlman, was that her name? Was one of the early ones.
Yes, faith healer. Right. So, contrast all, and one of the words put in is charismatic. We hear charismatic a lot. Pentecostals tend to be their own denominations. Church of God in Christ, Church of God Cleveland, Tennessee, Assemblies of God is one of the largest worldwide Pentecostal denominations. Charismatics are Christians who have had Pentecostal-like experiences, but have remained within traditional denominations. And there are charismatic Catholics, there are charismatic United Methodists, there are charismatic Presbyterians, there are charismatic Episcopalians, as oxymoronic as that may sound. It's happening. The fastest growing version of Christianity in the world for the last several decades has been Pentecostalism. A great deal of Central and South America and of Sub-Saharan Africa is Pentecostal Christian. Even in my daughter's country of birth in Guatemala, about a third of the population now is Protestant, not Catholic. And almost all of them are involved in Pentecostal denominations. All right. Modern factors leading to the rise in religious rights. As we're about up to the 50s and 60s. First, godless communism. We were the contrast to godless communism here in this country. And being religious people remained absolutely essential in order to show how we were not communist. In case you've forgotten this part of the history, in God we trust in the Pledge of Allegiance, with that included in God we trust, as well as putting the motto of the United States on the coin. This is a relatively recent invention. The pledge added "under God" in 1954. Dwight Eisenhower heard George Dougherty at the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church give a sermon in February 1954, and Eisenhower said, "Yes, I'd like to see that under God," and called somebody in Congress, and they made it happen. On coins, it was first in 1864 that the federal motto "In God We Trust" was first put on coins. And that was, Lincoln did that to appease some northern evangelicals who actually wanted to amend the Constitution to put "under God" in the Constitution. He said, "I'll put on the money." Just a few of them. But it wasn't until 1956 that "In God We Trust" replaced "E Pluribus Unum" as an actual motto. So again, 1950. There was the famous Supreme Court decision in 1962, Engel versus Vitale, and some people said, "Oh, that's when we kicked God out of the schools." No, that's when the Supreme Court ruled that there couldn't be school-sponsored prayers. It didn't mean one couldn't pray in school. And like they say at the First Amendment Center in Nashville, if you're going to blame all-American ills that would kick God out of school in 1962, then we should also blame racism for being in the schools when God was there. And Brown v. Board of Education, 1954. But it wasn't then until the middle 1960s where all this begins to accelerate. Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act days before the Republican convention. The GOP nominated Goldwater, Barry Goldwater, who ran on a states' rights platform. That's when the exodus of African Americans began out of the Republican Party, the Party of Lincoln. South Carolina Senator Strom Thurmond switched parties and then campaigned for Democrats in the South to turn Republican, and lobbied the South to vote first for Goldwater, then for Nixon, and then for Reagan. It was one of Nixon's strategists by the name of Lee Atwater. Some of you will remember that name. Atwater is sometimes known as the father of the Southern strategy. Since the Civil Rights Act and the mood in the country was such that overt racial slurs were no longer as acceptable as they once were. Boy, are we hearing this again, right? He said those can be replaced with abstractions, such as, let's talk about welfare or states' rights rather than race. Let's talk about freedom rather than racial discrimination. And let's talk about law and order rather than black urban crime. So in other words, there were a number of categories that were set up that could be substitutes for some of the issues that previously were connected to race. Following that, then, there was this issue about private schools and the IRS. I rely very heavily here on an article by a scholar of evangelicalism by the name of Randall Ballmer. But I highly recommend to you to go to YouTube and pull up Samantha Bee, a comedian, who has done 2 segments on this history, which I can't improve on. I can use less foul language in talking about it. But she really does a great job of it. But what she talks about, and what Ballmer talks about, is he said there was a catalyst for the formation of the religious right, which had nothing to do with abortion and nothing to do with homosexuality. But what it had to do with was racially segregated private schools. Because it was in 1969 1969 and 70, in fact, there was some suits against private academies in Mississippi that black parents said were formed as racially segregated white schools. The IRS at that point looked at those schools and said they violate what it means to be a 501c3 charitable entity, and revoked their 501c3 status, their nonprofit status. This made a lot of the conservative leaders in the country livid. This is what Palmer wrote. On June 30, 1971, the District Columbia Court issued a ruling in the case now called Green versus Connolly. The decision upheld the new IRS policy. Under the Internal Revenue Code, properly construed, racially discriminatory private schools are not entitled to the federal tax exemption provided for charitable educational institutions, and persons making gifts to such schools are not entitled to deductions provided in the case of gifts for charitable educational institutions. Paul Weyrich, who was key to forming the religious right in terms of funding it, said that he had tried for a couple of decades, in fact, to get the religious right organized. He said he'd been trying different issues, hoping one might pique evangelical interest. He tried pornography, he tried prayer in schools, he tried the proposed equal rights amendment, even abortion. He says, I was trying to get these people interested in those issues and I utterly failed. But this IRS ruling provided the necessary first step. It captured the attention of evangelical leaders, especially as the IRS began sending questionnaires to church-related, quote, segregation academies, unquote, including Jerry Falwell's own Lynchburg Christian School, inquiring about their racial policies. Falwell was furious. In some states, he famously complained, it's easier to open a massage parlor than a Christian school. Bob Jones University was then the other case in here, that really caught their attention. It was these cases that helped propel them into forming what became the moral majority. I'll come to that part of the story in a minute. Also, what worldwide, when we talk about fundamentalism and when we talk about the involvement of more conservative religious forces in politics, whenever patriarchy, as in the rule of men in society and in households, the sole rule of men, that is challenged, we see rights amendment, gay rights movement, and then finally Roe v. Wade in '73. We add to this, we're getting to the end of the 1970s here, we add evangelical disappointment with Jimmy Carter, who said, he wears a sweater, he says, turn down the thermostat, let's learn to live with less. Some quarters said, no, American exceptionalism has to go on as it was. We should be able to turn the thermostats as high as we want, but we just need more energy, and we need to find ways to get it. There was the remaining hostage crisis, which some person said, this shows his weakness. He refused to advocate for a constitutional amendment opposing abortion, even though some forces, by the end of the 1970s, there have been so many abortions, more than some of even the pro-abortion advocates had thought there would be. There began to be a reaction against abortion as it was being interpreted after Roe v. Wade. So along comes the moral majority and the Christian coalition. The moral majority forms in 1979. That is a famous phone call involving Paul Weyrich, Jerry Falwell, Tim LaHaye, who wrote that whole Left Behind series, if anybody's ever seen that in the Christian bookstores and the like. And they were on the phone saying, what issue, they were now energized. Let's do something. We need to do something together, change the direction of the country. What do we do? And it was on, they said, somebody on the phone call said, let's try abortion. Catholics were already opposed to it, and so they had the Catholic support, and then they began to build through literature and through their media outlets. They began to build support for an anti-abortion movement. This is also time when the mega churches are getting going. They're beginning to multiply some. I'm going to show you that slide again in a minute. Let's skip over that part of it, other than to say, they're in the evangelical, in this world of the formation now of the Christian right as a religious, political, like in between those two movements. Secular almost always has bad meaning to it. There's something wrong with secular. Something evil about it. Why? Because that's where Satan still has control over things. Remember I showed you this slide last week? The mega church, these are churches that worship 2,000 or more per Sunday. This is worship, not this is attendance now. 1960, very, very few. By 2012, we're up over 1,600 of them. Theologically, I also showed you this slide last week, 71% identify as evangelical, about 10% charismatic Pentecostal, only 1% fundamentalist, so that's not what we're dealing with. But those broadly on this side, whereas liberal about 0.5%. When the moral majority gets going, they also have this movement. They can say, what a great place to distribute literature. Now there are some of these churches, like let's take Life Church TV, one we know. They try to scrub politics. This is all about individual relationships, and they have very much individual relationship focus rather than in terms of other bigger things in society. But there are a number of these churches that are now distributing values voters guides, which all but said how to vote. What's the overall agenda? We talk Christian right. What is the agenda word that is today coming up to that? Too much? Yes, sorry. Moral majority is 79. It's replaced by the Christian Coalition in 89. Huge difference between the two. This focus on literature and media distribution. This focus on organizing. From the grassroots up. As in electing people to your local school boards, to the trash district, to anything you can elect them to. This also, part of this is also the homeschooling movement. There's an advocate for the homeschooling movement, including there's a college that formed, I think it was around 2000, called Patrick Henry College. Pretty small school, but the guy who founded it also supplies a lot of curriculum for a lot of homeschool parents. And his explicit, I mean, go to his website, go to the school's website. You can pull it all right off of there. Explicitly what they're trying to do is they are trying to form from homeschooling up through Christian colleges onto law schools that teach that this is a Christian nation. And how to argue the law from the point of view that this is I don't mean a Christian nation as in freedom for others. And I'm not even sure that means Christian nation as intolerance for others. But this is a Christian nation. This is what we're founded to be. Pat Robertson ran on this kind of platform as a 1988 candidate, but the word here was get organized. And it was out of this then that the organizations and think tanks and the like to help produce a whole crop of persons who came through this system who would eventually be candidates for federal judgeships, who would eventually be candidates for Supreme Court judgeships. There's a farm system, in other words, that was built from this time on to supply the judges in this country. Quickly on their agenda, you'll recognize a lot of this. Overturn Roe v. Wade, particular way of coming about what marriage and family means, taking welfare out of any sort of government and political circles and returning it to the kind of 19th century model of it belongs in nonprofits and only what the deserving for. Second Amendment rights, what exactly that has to do with, I mean, I'm actually not opposed to Second Amendment rights. But what exactly that has to do with Christianity, I'm still fuzzy on. Incarceration does not mean restorative justice, it means retributive justice. It means that evildoers, somebody's done evil and they ought to be punished. States' rights, federal overreach, looking for one-party control. Part of what I find is most difficult about the Christian right is its identification with one political party. Control of federal courts and SCOTUS. Dominion, I'm going to talk about very briefly in a moment. Supporting Israel. Why do they want to support Israel? Because it's where Jesus is going to return. It's the most interesting, one of the most interesting bedfellows I know of. This combination of Jesus succeeded Judaism. You're not a legitimate religion anymore. And we support Israel because that's where Jesus is going to return. Be strong in national defense, opposition to Islam. Our now ex-state legislator Bennett, who talked about Islam as a cancer that needs to be cut out of American society. want to be able to endorse candidates from the pulpit, the so-called overturning the Johnson Amendment, which unfortunately I read in the paper last Sunday, Senator Langford is putting forth that proposal again. And nothing I'm talking about is about electoral candidates. I'm talking about being able to talk about cultural, religious, political issues for how we think about this. The Eagle Forum is one of the oldest of these. She's really, Phyllis Schlafly was a grandmother of all this stuff. Go to her page and you'll see everything in here that has been proposed by anybody in the political right for the last 30 years. There's an extreme form of a religious right, as I'm coming up to my close here, called dominionism. It's an extreme form of Calvinism. These two men are largely associated with it, where they want to reconstruct this society based on Old Testament laws. By which they mean stoning of disobedient children and homosexuals. And they are explicit. This is not an interpretation, this is what they say. So if anybody's been watching The Handmaid's Tale on Hulu, Gilead there is what they have in mind. This is not a huge, I don't want to overblow this. This is the extreme right of the extreme right. But there are popularizers. D. James Kennedy, the Coral Ridge Hour, is a Presbyterian church that he pastored in Florida for all those years. David Barton, who is a constant thorn in the side of most textbook, high school textbook history textbook committees throughout the United States. When I tell history in a particular kind of way, make sure anything that the United States ever did wrong in our history is sort of expunged from that. His organization is called Wall Builders. Explicitly wants to see this be a Christian nation. Because they all believe Christians, and Christians only, have a God-given right to rule. When they say they've done the post-millennial, meaning that we build the kingdom here and Jesus will return, is what they're looking to do. Dominionism itself, this is a commandment to have dominion over this, what they call the seven mountains of culture: government, religion, media, family, business, education, arts, and entertainment. The United States is a Christian nation. Its legitimacy, the legitimacy of the Constitution for the Christian right is only to the extent that we are a Christian nation is the Constitution legitimate. No, what they're saying is that any interpretation of the Constitution which does not preference Christians here, which does not preference Christian evangelism here, is meant that this country has turned away from God, and if you've turned away from God, who are you with? Opponents are tools of Satan, not simply opponents. In fact, connecting one's opponents to Satan is essential. Now, I am not saying that Newt Gingrich believed this, but it was Gingrich who said during the Clinton years that we are at war here. The folks on the other side of the aisle, they are not our opponents, they are our enemies. We are not to compromise with them, we are to defeat them. Take that war language, take it alongside what else is in the water there. What do you start to have? Extreme polarization. And I won't go into, if anybody saw, Mikey Weinstein from the Military Religious Freedom Foundation, Air Force Academy graduate, son goes to the Air Force Academy, long ties to the Academy. Talk about how dominionism is well represented in the ranks of our military brass. It was one of the most disturbing talks I've ever heard, and I've done enough checking to see he's not making this up. What do we make of this? Some people say the Christian right is waning. Robert Jones, in his very well-read book these days, The End of White Christian America, says the demographics are just against white Christianity. By 2042, there'll be no racial ethnic majority in the United States, and more younger people are dropping out of religion as a whole, and more younger evangelicals even are believing differently from their parents. But then there was also the election of Donald Trump and the Christian right. 81% of self-identified evangelicals, 81% of self-identified white evangelicals voted for Trump. Now when you say, well, it's not about evangelicalism, no, it's not, because about 9% of African American evangelicals voted for Trump. So that's got something to do with not evangelicalism per se. But Trump, by the Christian right, President Trump has been said, well, he's not a Christian, right? It's not about character anymore, but he's really like Cyrus the Persian. Remember, Cyrus the Persian was the foreign king who liberated the people from captivity in Babylon. And one of the prophets said, he's the Mashiach. He's the anointed one. And some of the religious leaders around Trump have said he's the anointed one. They have also said he's Nehemiah. He's the wall builder. And you saw what the Christian right agenda was, and you've seen President Trump's policy. You see there's a strong affinity between the two. The white Christian evangelical base is aging, and so the question is, younger evangelicals, what will they do? Will they restock the Christian right, or kind of what we've seen from a lot of the younger folks, younger evangelicals, is they're tired of the politics, they're tired of the divisional stuff, and they're not going to follow where their parents have gone. As well as they tend to be a whole lot more on the progressive side when it comes to matters of sexuality. Especially Hispanic and African American kids as compared to where their parents are. Here's what I'm leaving with this concern tonight. So, Reinhold Niebuhr, theologian, wrote a book a number of years ago, The Children of Light versus the Children of Darkness. Right? There is within American politics and American religion what I would term a Manichaean turn. Manichaeanism was a religion that goes back into about the 2nd century BCE out of Iran or Persia, that said there were basically two gods, a good god of good and a god of bad, of light and of darkness. And there's constantly in the world a battle between the good and the bad, because led by these two. There are a lot of scholars who think that Manichaeanism affected the way Christianity is. You notice that in Judaism, as you see it throughout the Hebrew Bible, Satan is almost never mentioned. Really, about the only place Satan is mentioned is as God's prosecuting attorney in the Jerusalem. But in the New Testament, Satan's all over the place. Well, Manichaeanism was parts of it were drawn into first century Judaism, first century Christianity. And what we're seeing is we've seen a Manichaean turn that is represented in the Christian right and is also in politics. Again, so that it's not just opponents, my worthy opponent we're dealing with, where you're trying to do your best to compromise and all. No, what you're trying to do is now destroy the other side. What we've seen is in the religious right that follows on this more extreme side of politics, Satan is in control of this world. You are either with us or you're against us. And it's pretty purely one way or the other. One of the things that scares me most about the time we're in now is, what's the end game in relation to those with whom we disagree? Okay, so you and I disagree. So what do we do about that? Does that mean that one of us has to be converted? Does that mean one of us is going to be silenced? Does that mean one of us is going to have to tolerate the other? Does that mean one of us is going to be sequestered? own space? Does one of us have to be exiled or expelled? If you don't like the way it is, go back to where you came from. Or will one of us need to be exterminated? When you're dealing with a particular version of this, that is not an extreme statement. We know the way churches have dealt with this, heresy trials, but most likely split. Nothing keeps you together except your own voluntary will. Split, go form your own conference, go form your own district, go form your own whatever. But, this is my last point, I think this Manichaean worldview is incompatible with democracy in a multi-ethnic, multi-religious nation, with areas of dense population that we call cities, where the need for strategies of living well with difference is a matter of daily life and daily death. I'd really like to see my faith, my religion, my version of Christianity that contributes to that part of that sense that doesn't have Manichaean worldview in it. But I'm really afraid what Christianity has become in so many people's minds is supporting that Manichaean worldview right now. And that's a monumental challenge to see what we're going to do with that one. So, I'm sorry, I'm at time for questions, and I'd love to take some. So, but I also, it's past 8, so I'm going to say thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions on the room. Next week, I'm going to do my best to propose some alternative scenarios, some alternative meanings, some alternative narratives that maybe 2 or 3 of you might buy into it.
Can you put the Christian rights amendment, the Christian rights agenda back up while you're doing question and answer, please? Thank you.
What's to keep them from taking the basic position of using nuclear weapons to bring about an apocalypse?
Nothing. And you know, one of the things I didn't say that I had to look this up because it was like so unbelievable. I wasn't sure it was right. Mikey Weinstein was here years ago. He talked about how the Air Force has a training video. It's actually a lot of food for the guys who switch to the silent and who have to be, where they have a gun on each other. You don't know, if order comes through, somebody that would have done kill them. There was a PowerPoint that the Air Force used for training that was led by, according to the book of Revelation, part of the apocalypse that the moment comes that we're going to participate in the apocalypse if there's not well. And that got exposed, and the Air Force had to admit we made a mistake. Certainly that was so I think the short answer is nothing. Scary thing. I don't know common sense means different things to different people, depending on what premise you're on.